We are in Matthew chapter 5 today, and we continue our series called Staying Close, which is all about the book of Matthew and all about what it looks like to really learn to be an authentic disciple of Jesus, to really learn to be one who really deeply, deeply trusts him and very sincerely follows him from heart and into life. We've been talking about this idea of a disciple as one who stays close enough to the one who they've given themselves to that they're covered in the dust of their feet. And the idea of us growing in kind of a covering of dust of Jesus' feet in this season of our lives. And I pray that you are growing as we're walking through this book. Today, I'm excited to talk to you about righteousness. And as we are journeying through the book of Matthew, and as we've just started this journey through the Sermon on the Mount, there's really kind of two foundational things that Jesus is trying to communicate to us as his disciples to kind of reorient us to what real life with God really looks like, because it's gotten pretty messed up because of sin and all of us, sin in the world around us, and just the outworkings of that brokenness. Jesus is really bringing us back. He's like kind of bringing us back, and he's like, hey guys, we got to work on the fundamentals here. And there's two main things that Jesus wants to talk to us about. Last week we talked about how Jesus looks at us and he goes, I want to kind of redefine joy for you. I want to redefine what blessing and happiness really looks like for you. And if you missed last week, I encourage you to go back and listen, catch up online. And this week we're going to be talking about righteousness, because Jesus really wants to do some work within you to really help to redefine it God's way. When I put up the phrase righteousness for you, my question is like, what comes to your mind, right? What do you think of typically? I'm actually asking. Think about it for a second. Typically, most would say that you're thinking about like being good, right? Like a kind of goodness. Perhaps in our day-to-day, I think these two things kind of come up the most. It's like being moral, right? Like even this week with the election, like we're talking together about like what is right and what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And those things probably inform some of the framework of your thinking or even decision-making as you participate as a citizen of this country in this particular election. And we have strong basis for wanting to be moral, wanting to live morally, wanting to be seen as moral people, right? Which kind of leads into the second thing that I think is very common today, which is this idea of virtue signaling. I mean, is there any good deed if it's not seen on social media? You know what I'm saying? Like, have you actually done anything good if others don't know you've done it? I mean, my word. So this idea of being righteous is like, kind of like making sure that like we're good and we're good enough and that other people know that we're good enough. And hopefully God thinks we're good enough too. This morning, though, what I want you to see, the Sermon on the Mount is so profound, and it's truly, most would say, like the greatest sermon in all of history. And I'm sorry you came this morning. I know that's disappointing because you're not going to get that today from me. If I just read Matthew 5-7, it'd be better than what I'm about to preach. It's an amazing, amazing sermon. And of course, Jesus came to be a savior of your heart, not just a teacher, an example for you to learn to live better. He came to rescue and redeem your heart. And that's part of what makes this sermon, this teaching, so great. It's because the teaching is all a relentless pursuit of your heart. And he's here to kind of rewire these two foundational things. Last week we talked about joy. But this week, what I want to look at is righteousness. And I invite you to be curious with me. What does Jesus say? As we think about righteousness, like we kind of know what we might say. We kind of know what the world might say. We know kind of this idea of moralism or virtue signaling. But the real question is, what does the God of the universe say? What is this one who loves us and who came to give himself for us? Who came to invite us into a redeemed, renewed relationship with the living God? What does he say is real righteousness? That should be very, very important to you this morning, that you understand it conceptually, but also that you live in it personally and experientially. So today, real righteousness. Like I said, we talked about real joy last week. This morning, we talked about real righteousness. And you'll notice I'm skipping a few verses from where we ended last week. I promise next week we'll go back and catch those. But I wanted today, the way that I'm kind of teaching through this to lay these two foundational principles because they really inform the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you could get real joy and real righteousness God's way, then the rest of the teaching will really come to light and really kind of bear fruit in your life. So today's sermon, if you're taking notes, and I always hope you do, the title of today's sermon is Inside Out, all right? Not the movie, the sermon, okay? All right? The sermon's better than the movie. But Inside Out. And today, the subtitle of the sermon is The Pathway of Real Righteousness. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17 in your Bible. And again, I'll put up the picture of from a few years ago, our trip to Galilee. You remember Jesus is out in this area. He's gone into Galilee. Matthew 4 told us he's gone there because he's wanting to bear witness to light amidst a people who are dwelling in darkness. We know that the crowds are surrounding him. People are being healed. They're coming to him with their brokenness, with their diseases, with their infirmities. He looks out and he has compassion. He's restoring them. He's healing them. He's forgiving. People are experiencing something radically new with Jesus, and crowds are growing by the day. And as he sees the crowds growing and he's in this mountainous region, he kind of tucks himself up in a hillside that kind of creates a natural little amphitheater, and he sits down with the crowds who are there, and yes, he's there to take care of them physically in a lot of ways that they brought their neediness. But he's also there, like I said, to rescue and redeem their hearts. And so he speaks to them about what it looks like to experience real life with God. And we said last week, he's teaching these things. It's really the paradox of the kingdom. And I told you last week, some people call the Sermon on the Mount an upside down kind of kingdom. But I would argue that actually it's more about being Jesus coming to set things right side up. He's actually going, everything is upside down because of sin and brokenness, and I'm actually here to restore things to the way that they should be. Jesus is actually showing us the way of restoration. So as you listen into Jesus' words today, you've got to remember Jesus is teaching us about how things were always supposed to be and how he can make them to be if we yield our hearts and lives to him. So starting in verse 17, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them. I've come to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And I want you to go over to the start of chapter 6, verse 1, because I'm going to connect something that Jesus says in just a few sentences after verse 20. I'm going to connect this verse and this statement to the theme of today and this foundational principle of righteousness. Jesus says in verse 1, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Inside out, the path of real righteousness. Righteousness. What does Jesus say? All right? So today, what I want to do is kind of take this from the two angles of kind of what the world typically teaches, and then I want to look at it from the contrast of what Jesus is teaching and how Jesus sets everything right side up. And I really want you to evaluate this personally this morning, all right? Because every single one of us in the room today struggles with actually defining righteousness God's way. Every one of us falls into the two traps that I told you earlier, which is being moral, falling into the trap of moralism, we'll call it, and I'll define that in just a second, or falling into the trap of virtue signaling. And most of us fall into both traps every single day. Can I get a witness? Okay, so this morning, I want to look at righteousness, and I want to look at the something more. Could it be, the curiosity that I was inviting you to lean into, could it be that there's something more going on here, that Jesus wants something more than moralism, something more than virtue signaling. So we're going to take these one by one. So the first question, the curiosity is righteousness moralism, or is it something more? All right? You probably already know the answer to the question, but we're going to look at it. I want to go back to verse 17, because he addresses it directly here. When he describes, he's like, look, now this is kind of interesting. He comes in and he's like, I'm not here to throw out the law. I'm not here to abolish the law. I'm not here to abolish the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but I've come to fulfill them. In other words, he's not downplaying the role that the law has, the role that this set of morality, this framework of morality, these basic 10 commandments, even if you think back to Moses, right, on Mount Sinai, he's not saying that those are unimportant. He's not there to abolish them, but he says, I'm here to fulfill them. He's hinting at there's something deeper, there's something more. And he goes on, he says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot. Now, you know, in the Hebrew language, there's all these little markings, these small little markings that go along with the larger consonants that are there. And it's in these tiny little markings that often we find a word changing completely. I won't go into all the details of that. Just trust, I've studied Hebrew enough to know that I don't know it. It is very, very hard, right? I mean, I know enough to be an effective pastor, but it is a complicated language. And the way that the scribes and the prophets would go into all of these little markings, so important to really read the text accurately. And he's like, look, not even these smallest little markings will pass away. It's all really important. I'm here that it all is accomplished. And then he goes on to say, anybody who relaxes one of these small little things, in verse 19, they'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So he's not lowering the standard. In fact, if I'm listening to Jesus correctly, it's like he's raising the standard. He's like, no, it's all important. All of this that reflects God's holiness and God's character and God's will and God's ways, all of this is very, very important. Even down to the smallest little things that you might go, well, that's just unimportant. He said, no, it's very, very important. He's actually raising the bar of morality. Very interesting. But then he says in verse 20, and this is where it goes, huh? Because he's raising the bar of morality, and then he goes, but I'm telling y'all, he's looking out at the crowd there on the mountainside, that unless your righteousness surpasses that, exceeds that of those who are the students of this stuff, those who are the religious elite of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees, unless your righteousness exceeds that, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. In other words, you're going to miss it. And everybody's sitting around going, wait, what? Here's the heart of what Jesus is teaching. He's warning, and I know this because of how you read the rest of the book, right? Which we're going to have a wonderful journey through Matthew. Who knows how long it's going to take, but it's going to be fun. Everybody smile, right? It's going to be fun. We know that the scribes and the Pharisees had fallen into the trap again and again and again of moralism. In Matthew 23, which I'm not going to teach today, but I'll reference, you can look at it later, he pronounces all of these woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees because he says what they had cared about was the external way that their life was lived. They cared very much about looking the part, playing the part. He called them hypocrites, which is the Greek word for a play actor. He says they've got it all together on the outside. They do everything they do. It looks good. They clean the outside of the cup. They pressure wash the outside of the stone, but on the inside it's dirty. On the inside it's just dead, rotting bones. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you try to project this moralistic life, but I see you on the inside, and your insides are not matching your outsides. And this is why, by the way, so many people are deconstructing. This is why I empathize so much with so many young people who really struggle to trust the church, to struggle, to really understand, even in an election moment like this, people are looking at Christians, looking at the church at large, and they're wondering, is this legit? Is this authentic? Because in our day, there are a lot of play actors. There are a lot of people who take on outward moralistic Christianity, but on the inside, it's pretty evident like it's just dead bones. And a lot of people, this is why our church has tried, and I know we don't do it perfectly, but we've tried to be a safe place for thinking people, skeptical people, doubting people, people who just are trying to figure it out. And if that's you this morning, we just welcome you here to journey with us. Because Jesus is looking out, he's going, I see it too, but it's never been about that. He's calling out this moralistic behavior that's not real righteousness. So what is moralism? I'm going to put up some slides, and I would encourage you to take notes if you would, because I want one of my biggest burdens for you, for our church, is that we would be a moralistic group of people who, on the external, adhere to the kind of structures of the moralistic code of Christianity, but yet on the inside don't actually have Christ. It's one of my great, great fears, is that you would, and for my own daughters, that they would grow up to be moral people, but not Jesus-loving people. There's a big difference. What is moralism? Moralism is this. It's you believe that God cares about only your behavior and not your heart. You believe that God cares about only your behavior, the outside stuff, and not your heart. And interestingly, a lot of people may not even agree. People who are moralistic may not even know that this is how they're living, but this is actually how they're living. Functionally, you just act as if it's the outside stuff that matters. Moralism, another way of defining it would be to be content with believing the right things and doing the right stuff is all that God wants. So if I just believe the right things and I just do the right stuff, then I'm good. That's functional moralism. Okay? Another way to say this would be to understand moralism is really behavior modification without interior examination or transformation. A lot of one of the hallmarks of moralists is that they don't really know themselves very well. And this is one of the reasons that our subtitle of this series matters so much, bringing the real me to the real Jesus. As Rich Villodas says, you cannot know God deeply while being a stranger to yourself. A lot of moralists do not know themselves well. There's not a lot of space for interior examination at all. They don't even know who their real self is, or they're not dealing with their real self, and therefore they struggle to actually bring their authentic self to the authentic Jesus, and therefore miss transformation. But moralism is essentially the overlay, the example that I think of sometimes right now by my door. This is very embarrassing. We are between seasons, and I effectively killed the plants by my door by the end of summer, like they were toast. I know in 1 month I'm about to put out Christmas trees. So right now, if you come over to my house, there's 2 cute trees by my door, but they are fake, 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 all right? They look the part, but on the inside, it's just plastic. Moralism is essentially looking the part, but on the inside, there's nothing there. It's not real. There's no life flowing. It's just the IKEA version of a real plant. And there's a lot of us today that live the IKEA Christianity, where we don't have the real thing, but it sure looks like it. It's external behavior modification, but it's without that work of interior examination. We don't even know our real selves, or we're scared of it, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and we certainly haven't been transformed. I'll say this, and this leads right into what I am trying to get at, where we don't know ourselves. A lot of moralism, and I'm dabbling in counseling here, and I'm not going to counsel you this morning. I'm just going to preach to you. But if this interests you, then find a great Christian counselor. And if you don't have one, come talk to us, and we'll recommend one. Moralism, actually, at its root, is often driven by fear, shame, pride, and performance. Moralism, at its root, is often the outworking of something much deeper. And again, a lot of moralists have struggled to do the work of interior examination to even understand what is motivating moralism. It just comes out as this. And here's what I'm trying to say when I call these out. It's often driven by these deeper needs that we're trying to meet, or by a woundedness that we're trying to soothe. And so what happens is, because there's this deeper brokenness within us, it often is that we're trying with being good and being good enough for others, for God, more importantly, that we're trying to actually meet these needs, and we're actually trying to soothe these wounds, but we're just trying in the wrong direction. And what you end up with in moralism is working non-stop to try to secure love from God, love from others, and to try to attain status, to try to be good enough, to try to be right enough, to try to feel like you're okay, like in the end. But what the reality of it is that you're just living on the surface. And all the while, you're just ignoring these deeper issues. One year, it was about 3 years ago, the same plant issue happened. My Christmas trees, though, this time died. And they just turned brown before I could get to the spring trees, before they were put out at Lowe's. So I just decided, well, I'll just take them out in the yard and buy a can of green spray paint. And I just sprayed those dead things. Now, y'all are all going, he's got problems with plants, and I do. I have a lot of problems with plants. But, a lot of us, kind of spray paint our lives. I really think that. A lot of us feel like we know that we're, dead on the inside, and yet we feel this, need to be, right on the outside. We feel this standard of Jesus is, this stuff does matter. And with others, we feel even in the cultural of Christianity, which I think is increasingly diminished, but there can be even pressures to look a certain way in front of other people. And we just end up, even though we're dead on the inside, and even though we're not motivated by real life, we haven't really been transformed. We just spray paint, don't we? We just spray paint over those things that are really dead, and we just try to give the appearance of life, but on the inside there are these deeper issues. All of this, again, part of this issue of behavior modification without interior examination or transformation. Now, this is the reality. It got very quiet, right? Because all of us know that this is the reality of our condition as we approach Jesus on the hillside. We bring these external things to him, like the crowd that day. Help this, heal this, answer this. And Jesus looks at us and he goes, okay, I can do that, but I want to talk to you about your heart. And we're sitting there on the hillside listening to him speak, and he's speaking about this deeper stuff, and we're all going, dang, yeah, that's a thing. I've seen that in others, but I also see that in me. And be careful. What I would say, if you're one who's deconstructing or questioning the church or frustrated at Christianity, I think you're right to ask big questions, to have doubt, skepticism, to call out unrighteousness and moralism and all of that for what it is, but be careful in pointing at others that you miss doing work yourself. Because I think what Jesus is trying to get us to do is he's like, you can point at the scribes, you can point at the Pharisees, and I'm pointing at them too, but he also is like, but I'm also talking to you. There's still a righteousness. While you may be frustrated at the way they've gone about righteousness, there's still a righteousness that's needed for you. And the question is, what does that real righteousness look like? What does it look like for you personally, apart from other people, to actually come out of moralism? And this is what he says, verse 17. I've not come to abolish these things, but I've come to fulfill them. What he's saying is, again, I'm not come to lessen the call. I'm actually come to fulfill the call, but this pathway is different. He says you've got to do something more in verse 20. Remember, you've got to do something more than what the scribes and Pharisees are doing. You've got to exceed their righteousness. That's, we know, kind of this exterior righteousness, but there's something more for you. And that's the beauty of what we lean into. Is righteousness moralism? Is that what he's talking about? The firm answer is what? No. Okay? But what is it? Well, let's talk about it. Following Jesus is actually not moralism. It's completely the opposite. And this is so exciting, y'all. This is the start of a conversation this morning, but it certainly will not be the end, because the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, the rest of the book of Matthew, the rest of your time following Jesus is going to be all about what we're talking about right now. It's actually quite the opposite. Jesus turns righteousness from a checklist into a matter of the heart. Real righteousness is not about this list that you check off. Rather, it's about your heart. Another way of saying this is that Jesus cares about who we are becoming, not just about what we're doing. He cares about you, who you are, how you are, your posture of heart before the Lord. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Yes, he himself, the fulfillment of the law. He keeps the law perfectly, and in that way, he provides a righteousness that is external to us, that he gives to us as we put our trust in Jesus. As we repent of sin and we put our trust in Jesus, Jesus supplies a righteousness to us that is not ours, but his. He fulfills righteousness in that way, but he also provides a personal righteousness to us as he transforms our hearts from the inside out. Do not be conformed by this world, but be transformed, Romans 12, 1 and 2, by the renewal of your mind. There's an inside out, a metamorphizo, like the word metamorphosis that we use of a butterfly. From the inside out comes this change. And in that way, Jesus also is saying, I'm here to fulfill righteousness. I've come to work within you so that from within you comes out of you actual righteousness before God. Righteousness that's not spray paint, that's not IKEA plastic. Righteousness that comes from a real surrendered heart before God. A real righteousness. See, Jesus is bringing the true intent of the law to light. He's actually moving beyond the surface to the heart of God's very commandments. He's going to be relentless. So I dare y'all to come to church for the next 2 months. That's a risky thing for a pastor to say because I really want you here. But come at your own risk, so to speak. Because Jesus is going to be relentless at moving beyond the surface to your heart. He's going to go, oh, you think you're good because you haven't murdered? But it's never about murder, it's about hate. You ever dislike someone? You ever been frustrated with them? Like, it's about that. Like, I've come to change that. Oh, you think you're good because you haven't committed adultery? Like, it was never about adultery. It was about these groanings and lust and desires within your heart that all of us in every area of sexuality have found distorted in some way or another. It was always about the purity of heart, not just about the checklist of adultery. Oh, you feel good because you tithe? It was never about the 10%. It was always about you learning that God is generous and you need to be generous. So grow beyond 10% checklisting. Grow to find a way to live minimally so you can maximally invest in things that matter for eternity. Oh. And suddenly you're going, well, dang. And the reason it's so challenging at the same time so wonderful is because we have a sense that actually this is what it's really about. It was always about our hearts. Jesus said the greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love from your heart. It's not about this external spray paint stuff, trying to get ourselves together and keep a certain checklist. It's about yielding our hearts over to God and loving him with our all. Following Jesus, put it simply, is about the heart. It's about the heart. Jesus does not allow you to live on the surface. And it is the most wonderful part of relationship with Jesus, is he constantly is pushing through. This is why in every CG we're like, okay, let's get beyond the triviality. It's good to have friendships and have, casual conversations, but let's get real. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's like, let's get real. Like, what are your fears? What are your struggles? Like, what do you do when nobody's looking? Where are the places that you're tempted to go? Like, everybody has it. Let's get real about you. What's your story? Where's your pain? Like, what's going on beneath the surface? Let's get real. Let's talk about your heart. He refuses to let us just stay on the surface. He calls us deeper. And in calling us deeper, what's interesting is he's calling us higher. So Jesus calls us to a higher righteousness that comes from a heart that's truly longing to be with God. So, true righteousness. More than outward behavior, right? We've established that. More than outward behavior. It's about an inner transformation. Jesus rejects a spirituality that does not transform our hearts. He does. So in every area where you are just role-playing and you know where they are, he's like, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to work from the inside out. This is not about role-playing. This is not about external rule-keeping. This is not about checklisting. This is about where your heart is. In every area of your life, I want your heart. 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 He wants to transform our hearts. We'll talk about the outworkings of this as we go through the rest of the series. But I want to leave, before I go to the second and final kind of conversation of this day, I want to leave with just a thought and a reflection for you. Because following Jesus is not about moralism, but really another way to say this is about your motivations. Okay, so what I want you personally, and perhaps with your family and your CG this week, to really talk about this is like one way of getting, and one-on-one with individuals, I'll do this all the time. What you want to try to do is get at the deepest possible level of your motivation, to really understand, to allow space for examination of who you are and how you're doing, but also to leave space for transformation. Why is it that you do the things you do? Why is it that you come to church? Why is it that you pray before a meal? Is that because you're supposed to, or is it because you want to? Why is it that you give? Why is it that you serve? Why is it that you go on a mission trip? Why is it that you do the work you do? Why is it that you put that thing on Instagram or whatever? You know, it's like, what is motivating this stuff? Because if you look at what Jesus is saying is like true righteousness has to go beyond service. It has to. True righteousness is deeper, and it really is the overflow of belonging to God. That's what's so interesting about true righteousness. Is actually true righteousness comes from knowing that we are loved by God and choosing to belong to Him, not because of what we do, but because what He does for us. Because we know Him and we know His grace, we know His acceptance of us, and we just belong to Him. And out of our belonging to Him and our great love for Him, therefore, we live out of that. We live out of that. Abide in me, John 15. Abide in me, for with me all things are possible, but apart from me you could do nothing. So it's this inside-out thing. As we draw from Jesus, we're not living out to earn His love. We already have His love. We're drawing from His love, and because we have His love, we're then living out this life that reflects His love, His righteousness, to the world around us. Paul says love is the fulfillment of the law. If you love God completely, your life is going to look like this high standard that Jesus is calling us to. It's just the way to that, the pathway to that is completely what we consider upside down, but actually Jesus says, actually, this was right side up. So, is it about moralism? No, it's a matter of the heart. As you reflect this week, here's what I want you to think about. A couple of questions. What areas are you checking off the boxes rather than seeking a deeper relationship with God? Where are you relying on outward actions to feel righteous? What areas of your life right now are you going, that actually makes me feel more righteous when I do that? Where are those places? And what would it look like for you to live in alignment with God's heart rather than just solely focusing on outward obedience? Andrew and Caleb will help to work some of these into our CG guides for the week, and you'll have more time to think about them, reflect on them. Some of y'all are taking pictures of the screen, and I just want to be like, smile, But we will try to find a way. If you're not a fast writer, I know it's hard to get all these down in the midst of the sermon, but I do pray you'll reflect on these this week. Now, as we move to the second conversation, which is the final conversation, is this other idea, right? So as we talked about the way the world defines righteousness, we talked about moralism, but we also talked about this temptation toward virtue signaling, all right? Virtue signaling. And y'all, even before there was Facebook and Instagram to like snapshot, yourself when you're doing good stuff, apparently, like, there was ancient versions of this that the scribes and the Pharisees figured out, because Matthew 6:1 is basically all about that. He's like, beware of doing this stuff, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, right? He's like, be careful about this stuff. It's just the reality that we live in a day. Another way of, I use the phrase virtue signaling because I think it works today, but essentially it's this idea of performative spirituality, okay? To understand virtue signaling, it's this idea that I'm going to do what I'm going to do so that it's not just about being good, trying to be good, it's about other people seeing me in a certain way. I'm going to live in this performative spirituality. Another way to say this would be there's this deep desire to actually display my goodness to other people. Like, I want other people to know that I'm good. I want other people to know that I'm good enough. And what's so tempting about this and so potentially dangerous about this is that it really plays on this God-given desire. Like, we have this longing to be known and seen as humans. We do. And this longing was given to us by God. Like, we have a longing to be known and to be loved for who we are, to be seen for who we really are, and to be loved as we really are. We have a longing for that. And so what the problem is, though, is that in virtue signaling, like, you're essentially, you're taking this longing and you're trying to, like, be seen and loved and known, but you're doing that through the outworking of, like, trying to do this right stuff, right? Like, trying to do the right things and in the right way, so that by doing that stuff, you can actually be seen as being good and be seen as being righteous. But y'all, it just corrodes the soul. Because in virtue signaling, essentially what we're really struggling with here is that you're seeking from other people what really can only be given to you by God. And it just doesn't work. It just, by God's design, it doesn't work. So is righteousness moralism? No. Is righteous virtue signaling? The answer is, well, I'll let Jesus say it. Go back to verse 1. What does he say? Beware. Beware. Like, stay away from this stuff. Like, it's not good for your soul. Like, beware of practicing righteousness before other people. Beware of virtue signaling. Beware of performative spirituality. Like, stay away. Like, it's not good. This is not God's way. So the answer is, of course, what? No. And the reason is the same with moralism. Following Jesus is not about virtue signaling. In fact, it's just the opposite. And this is where Jesus comes in and he just speaks to you. And he's like, hey, like, I know that you struggle with this. And I'm calling you back to God's way. It's just the opposite. And whereas with moralism, it was all about the heart. Here's where Jesus gets at you here. He says, following me is actually all about hiddenness. A key characteristic of following Jesus is hiddenness. Which just flies in the face of everything that we kind of probably assigned to the definition of righteousness at the start of this sermon. It's like, wait, what? Like, what? Yeah, hiddenness. Like, true righteousness is a hidden righteousness. It's not that it can't be seen by others, but it's motivated not to be seen by others at all. In fact, true righteousness seeks God's approval, not human recognition. The truest righteousness is the one that God sees. It's not what other people think of you, it's what God thinks of you. Other people look at your checklist stuff. They look at the spray paint stuff. They don't know if your trees by the door are real or not. They just drive by and they're like, those are cute. But they have no idea that they're just fake IKEA rubber. But God knows. God knows what's on the inside of you. And what he sees is what matters in the end. That's what's true of you. That's the real you. What is happening there in that real place that he sees? What's happening in that secret place? See, here's the thing. If you could learn to live like this, you could be fulfilled and you could be free, because here's why. Applause from other people fades so quickly. But really, it's only the affirming words of our Father that can really fill our hearts. What you really want is to be seen and to be known and to be loved. Yes, that's a longing that God's given you, but what you really need is to hear that he sees you and he knows you and he loves you. Like, that should be enough. The fulfillment of the pleasure of a father as you yield your heart and life to him. As you say, Dad, like, I just want to come back to you. That in Luke 15, in the parable of the prodigal son, that's what pleased the father. It wasn't the boy cleaning himself up before he came home. It wasn't the boy's offer of working in your house, Dad, forever, just like the hired hands. No, what pleased the father was the boy wanted to be back home. The boy wanted a relationship. That was real righteousness. Because the father saw through to his heart. He came back home. And that's what the father wants. He wants you to be home. And as you're home, to live out of that sonship, daughtership, to live as his loved one, the affirmation is there. And to live out of that love that he has for you, to love him in return, that is real righteousness. Following Jesus, friends, is about being a whole person and not about doing religious things. That's what following Jesus is like. Jesus cares about the real you, and he cares about the whole you. And it looks like being whole in a love relationship with Jesus and living out of that. Man, it's just huge. It's not this kind of scrupulous spirituality where you're just always freaking out that I'm going to do something wrong, that he's going to be displeased by. I mean, he cares about you living surrendered to him. He cares that, like I said, he upholds the law. He came to fulfill it. He raises the standard. But what he cares about is that you live motivated in a hidden life by your desire for him and him alone. And is that messy along the way? Sure it is, for all of us. But does he love to see us loving him and pursuing him and following him? Does Jesus love to see us staying close and covered in the dust of his feet, despite Peter putting his foot in his mouth time and again, despite Thomas occasionally freaking out and doubting, despite, all the silliness of the disciples? What he loved was their honest pursuit of him. He knew that their hearts were with him and for him, that they trusted him and would follow him. And occasionally, yes, they messed up, and occasionally, yes, he had to correct them. But they were sincere in their trust and following of him. And that's what he wants to see in you. What is sincere in you? Not surface in you. What is sincere in you? And we got to live out of that love and acceptance by God without any performance. And what Jesus says is, he'll say it again and again as we get into chapter 6. Like he says it about prayer, he says it about giving. What the Father sees in secret, he will reward. See, Jesus sees us in the secret place. And he promises reward if we live for his approval alone. So is righteousness virtue signaling? No. It's a matter of hiddenness. And I'll leave you with these questions before we close the message for you to reflect on personally with your groups this week. And it's this, are we doing good to be seen as good people? Do you feel satisfied if that's as far as it gets? Or do you care? Do you really care about seeking to please God? What if God sees you and is pleased with you and other people disapprove? Ooh, that's hard, right? Like we talked about last week with being persecuted. Like, what if actually you do the right thing and other people in your life go, I can't believe you did that. Or I'm actually really disappointed. Ooh, that's a word that we don't like, right? Really disappointed in you. And you're living out of a motivation of being pleasing to God, and you're obeying Him, you're following the prompting of the Spirit, and yet it disappoints other people. Like, how does that sit with you? Again, it's a good test of where your heart is, and do you have this external righteousness, or is it a real righteousness from the heart? Are we loving God and others genuinely? Or are we focused on maintaining an image of righteousness? There's a real pathway to real righteousness, and it doesn't look like the one the world offers. As I close this sermon and we get back to this conversation of inside out, I just would say, to ask the question at the beginning, if you were sitting on the mountain that day and you're to go, Jesus, like, okay, righteousness, can we talk about it? What does He say? What does He say? The two things we've talked about today is He says, it's about your heart. It's about what happens in the hidden place. That is real righteousness. I'll summarize it in a main point that I gave you at the very end, just like last week. Real righteousness is inward. It is this inward reality. It's a hidden life where the heart loves God and delights in His approval alone, rather than in good behavior or human praise. David struggled with this in Psalm 51. Oh, if I could just make it the right sacrifice, if I could just do the right thing, if I could just kind of keep the right law. And he's like, no, but the sacrifices that please God, it's a broken and contrite heart, God. Oh, God, you will not despise. It's all about the heart, from the inside out. That's real righteousness. This hidden life. And see, that's the thing. I look at you, I look at all of you, and I love you with all my heart, but I don't know your hearts. I mean, I think I do. I can see evidences of that, but only God really knows the real you. He knows your heart. And where it gets really, really fun with Jesus is when you come to Him with your real heart and you say, Jesus, I don't want to play the external Christian religious game. I don't want to be a good boy, a good girl. I don't care what other people think of me. Jesus, I just want you. Because you're the real deal. And more than just want you, Jesus, I need you, because I hear you. Like, you're not lessening the standard, you're raising it. And I know I fall really far short. Like, I am really broken and messed up. And I don't even come close in terms of what I can do for you. Jesus, I need you, because the righteousness that I need is one that only you can provide. I need you, Jesus. I believe that you came for me. I believe you came on a rescue mission. I believe that as I come to you, you have what it takes to actually bring the real change that I need in my heart. Jesus, I'm sorry for my sin. I'm sorry for my brokenness. I'm sorry for my spray paint and my plastic areas of life. I'm sorry. But Jesus, I want it to be real. I believe you're real. So Jesus, would you save me? Would you change me? Would you forgive me? Would you heal me? Would you restore me? Would you let from the inside out my life be pleasing to you? This is real righteousness. The question is, how are you pursuing it?